December 3rd, 1945. The English Channel churns beneath a gray winter sky, its waters restless and unforgiving. Aboard HMS Ocean, a light fleet carrier barely 4 months old, hundreds of eyes turn skyward. Among them, Captain Casper John stands on the bridge, his face a mask of controlled tension. He knows that what happens in the next few minutes could change naval warfare forever or end in catastrophe. Somewhere above the clouds, a sound unlike any other cuts through the air. Not the familiar roar of piston engines that had dominated the skies for decades, but something entirely different. A high-pitched whine, the scream of the future. Lieutenant Commander Eric Melrose Brown, universally known as Winkle due to his diminutive stature of just 5 feet 7 inches, guides his de Havilland Sea Vampire through the gray December sky. The jet fighter, painted in dark navy colors, registration LZ51AG, represents the bleeding edge of aviation technology. And Brown is about to attempt something that many believe to be impossible. To understand the magnitude of this moment, we must journey back to the beginning. We must understand the man, the machine, and the madness that brought them together on this cold winter day. Eric Brown was born on January 21, 1919, in Leith, Scotland, near Edinburgh. From his earliest days, the sky called to him. His father, Robert John Brown, was a Royal Air Force officer who took young Eric for his first flight when the boy was just 8 years old. That single experience ignited a passion that would define his entire life, the sensation of leaving the earth behind, of seeing the world from above, of defying gravity itself. It was intoxicating. But Eric's path to greatness was anything but straightforward. He attended the Royal High School in Edinburgh and later Fettes College before enrolling at the University of Edinburgh. In 1939, as storm clouds gathered over Europe and the world teetered on the brink of war, Brown made a decision that would define his destiny. He volunteered for the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm on December 4, 1939. Britain had been at war with Germany for 3 months. Brown's early training took place at the Royal Naval Air Station Sydenham in Belfast, Northern Ireland. Having already learned to fly with the University Air Squadron, he was assigned to a flying refresher course. The instructors quickly recognized something special in this young Scottish pilot. He had an almost supernatural feel for aircraft, an ability to sense what a plane needed before it happened. His hands and feet seemed to communicate directly with the control surfaces, bypassing conscious thought entirely. By early 1941, Brown had joined 802 Naval Air Squadron, flying Grumman-Martlet fighters from HMS Audacity, the Royal Navy's first escort carrier. But Audacity was no ordinary vessel. She was tiny, her deck so short that landing on her was, as Brown himself later recalled, challenging to say the least. The ship had been converted from a captured German merchant vessel, and her flight deck was barely long enough for the fighters to land safely. One mistake, one miscalculation, and a pilot would end up in the freezing Atlantic. Brown proved his mettle quickly. During convoy escort operations, he shot down 2 German Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor long-range patrol bombers, massive 4-engine aircraft that hunted Allied convoys like wolves stalking sheep. These victories came at great personal cost. During one engagement, Brown's Martlet was hit by return fire from a Condor. Shrapnel tore through the aircraft, and a piece of metal struck Brown in the shoulder. The pain was excruciating, a white-hot lance that made every movement agony. But Brown didn't bail out. He didn't turn back. He kept fighting, kept flying, until the German bomber tumbled from the sky, trailing smoke and flame. Then came December 21st, 1941. A date seared into Brown's memory forever. HMS Audacity was sailing with convoy HG-76 when German U-boats found them. The attack came at dusk, that dangerous time when the light plays tricks on the eyes and submarines can approach unseen. A spread of torpedoes lanced through the water. One of them found Audacity. The explosion was tremendous, a deep, bone-shaking detonation that lifted the small carrier partially out of the water before dropping her back down. Brown was thrown across the deck, his ears ringing, his vision blurred. All around him, men scrambled for survival stations. The ship was sinking. Already her bow was dipping toward the dark waters. Brown and the other survivors abandoned ship, plunging into the North Atlantic in the middle of winter. The cold was beyond description. It wasn't just cold. It was a living thing, a predator that clawed at exposed skin, that drove icy needles deep into the chest with every breath. Men died within minutes, their bodies simply shutting down as hypothermia claimed them. Brown spent the entire night in the water, clinging to debris, surrounded by the dead and dying, listening to the cries of drowning men fade into silence. Of the 24 men in Brown's immediate group, only 2 survived until rescue came at dawn. Brown was one of them. Out of Audacity's crew of 480, 407 lived. But 73 men went to the bottom of the Atlantic that night, including many Brown had called friends. That experience would have broken many men. The trauma of watching comrades die, of spending hours in the freezing ocean, of coming so close to death that you could feel its breath on your face. But Brown was different. Rather than breaking him, the experience forged something harder within him, a determination, a refusal to let fear dictate his actions, a commitment to master his craft so thoroughly that he could save lives rather than lose them. After his recovery, Brown was assigned to operational duties with Royal Canadian Air Force squadrons based in Britain. His job was to train them in deck landing techniques for carrier operations. Ironically, this training took place entirely on land, using airfields to simulate carrier decks. But Brown also flew with the Canadians on escort missions, protecting American B-17 Flying Fortress bombers during their raids over occupied France. The missions were dangerous, grueling work. German fighters swarmed like angry hornets around the bomber formations, and Brown and his fellow escort pilots had to be constantly vigilant. But Brown's true calling lay elsewhere. In late 1943, he was posted to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, the heart of British aviation research and development. Here, the best and brightest minds in aeronautics pushed the boundaries of what was possible. And here, Brown would become a test pilot, a profession that combined extraordinary skill with calculated risk-taking in equal measure. As Chief Naval Test Pilot, Brown's job was to evaluate new aircraft designs and techniques for carrier operations. By the end of 1943, he had made approximately 1,500 deck landings on 22 different aircraft carriers. 1,500, each one a carefully controlled crash, a moment where everything could go wrong in an instant, and Brown had survived them all. On March 25, 1944, Brown achieved his first major aviation first. He successfully landed a de Havilland Mosquito, a twin-engine fighter bomber, on HMS Indefatigable. This was revolutionary. Twin-engine aircraft were considered too large, too heavy, and too complex for carrier operations. The risk of one engine failing during the approach, creating asymmetric thrust that could send the plane cartwheeling into the sea or smashing into the carrier's superstructure, was simply too great. But Brown studied the problem, developed new techniques, and proved the skeptics wrong. The Mosquito, with its elegant wooden construction and devastating firepower, could operate from carriers. Then came April 4, 1945. On this day, Brown made another groundbreaking carrier landing, this time in a Bell P-39 Airacobra fitted with a tricycle undercarriage. This was significant because virtually all carrier aircraft up to that point used tailwheel configurations. The tricycle gear, with its nose wheel, changed the entire dynamic of carrier landings. It required different techniques, different timing, different instincts. Once again, Brown had to essentially invent the playbook as he went. But these achievements, as remarkable as they were, would pale in comparison to what was coming. because by 1945, the world of aviation was undergoing a revolution that would make everything that came before seem quaint and outdated. The jet age had arrived. The story of jet propulsion goes back to the mind of a brilliant British engineer named Frank Whittle. In 1930, while still a young flight cadet at the RAF College Cranwell, Whittle had written a thesis on future developments in aircraft design. He proposed a radical idea. Instead of using piston engines to turn propellers, why not compress air, mix it with fuel, ignite it, and use the expanding gases to create thrust directly? The concept was elegant in its simplicity, but the engineering challenges were enormous. Whittle spent years developing his ideas, often using his own money when official support dried up. He founded Power Jets Limited and, by 1937, had a working prototype engine. The British Air Ministry, initially skeptical, eventually recognized the potential and provided funding for development. By 1941, the Gloucester E-2839, powered by Whittle's W1 engine, took to the skies in Britain's first jet-powered flight. Meanwhile, in Germany, parallel developments were taking place. The Germans actually beat the British into the air with jet power, and by 1944, the Messerschmitt Me 262 was operational, a twin-jet fighter that could outrun anything the Allies had. But Germany's chaotic development process, political interference, and dwindling resources meant the Me 262 came too late to change the outcome of the war. De Havilland, the company that had produced the magnificent Mosquito bomber, recognized the potential of jet propulsion early. They approached Frank Halford, a brilliant engine designer who had created the H-1 engine, later renamed the Goblin. Halford's design was a centrifugal flow turbojet, producing about 2,100 pounds of thrust. It wasn't hugely powerful by later standards, but it was reliable, and, crucially, it was British. De Havilland designed an airframe around the Goblin engine. The result was the DH-100, initially nicknamed the Spider Crab due to its unusual appearance. The aircraft featured a unique twin-boom design. The pilot sat in a central nacelle, a pod-like fuselage made of wood and metal, with excellent visibility through a bubble canopy. Behind the pilot, the Goblin engine was mounted, its exhaust exiting between the twin tail booms. This configuration was dictated by engineering necessity. The early jet engines needed short, straight jet pipes to minimize thrust loss. Putting the engine in the center of the aircraft, with the exhaust exiting at the back, was the most efficient solution. The twin booms extended back from the wings, each terminating in a vertical stabilizer. A horizontal tailplane connected the two booms. The overall effect was strange, ungainly even, but the aircraft was actually beautifully engineered. The first prototype, LZ-548-G, flew on September 20, 1943, with Geoffrey de Havilland, Jr. at the controls. The results were immediately impressive. The aircraft handled well, was stable, and could reach speeds in excess of 500 miles per hour. This was far faster than any propeller-driven fighter in British service. The aircraft was soon renamed the Vampire, a name that captured both its speed and its somewhat sinister appearance. By 1945, the Vampire F-1 was entering service with RAF Fighter Command. The war in Europe ended in May 1945 before the Vampire could see combat, but it was clear that this aircraft represented the future. The Royal Navy watched these developments with intense interest. Aircraft carriers had proven their worth during the war, particularly in the Pacific, where they had become the dominant force in naval warfare. The era of the battleship was over. Now, naval power resided in the ability to project air power across vast distances. But carrier-based aircraft had always operated under severe constraints. They needed to be strong enough to withstand the brutal forces of arrested landings, yet light enough to take off from short flight decks. They needed powerful engines for performance, Yet those engines needed to be reliable in the harsh maritime environment. Jet engines offered tantalizing possibilities. They provided high speed without the torque issues of piston engines, which could flip an aircraft over during takeoff if the pilot wasn't careful. They were mechanically simpler in some ways, with fewer moving parts than the complex piston engines and their reduction gearboxes, and they offered the potential for even higher performance as the technology matured. But jets also presented enormous challenges for carrier operations. The early jet engines, like the Goblin, had slow throttle response. Advancing the throttle from idle to full power could take 10 or even 15 seconds, an eternity when approaching a carrier deck. This meant that if a pilot needed to abort a landing, to wave off and go around for another attempt, the engine might not spool up fast enough to prevent the aircraft from sinking into the sea. Jets also consumed fuel at a prodigious rate, especially at low altitudes. A piston engine fighter might have an endurance of several hours. A jet fighter of that era might only stay airborne for 45 minutes on internal fuel. For carrier operations, where aircraft might need to orbit while waiting for their turn to land, or might need to divert to another ship if the deck was fouled, this limited endurance was a serious problem. And then there was the fundamental question, could a jet aircraft even land on a carrier? The high approach speeds, the slow engine response, the different handling characteristics. Many experienced naval aviators believed it simply couldn't be done safely. Oh, perhaps a test pilot with exceptional skill might manage it once under ideal conditions. But routine operations with pilots of varying skill levels in all weathers at night? Impossible. The casualty rate would be catastrophic. Captain Casper John, the commanding officer of HMS Ocean, understood these concerns. Born on March 22, 1903, John was the son of the famous artist Augustus John. Unlike his bohemian father, Casper had chosen the ordered world of naval service. He had joined the Royal Navy in 1916 at the age of 13, entering the Royal Naval College at Osborne on the Isle of Wight. He had served with distinction throughout his career, including flying duties with the Fleet Air Arm. During the Second World War, John had served on HMS York, participating in Atlantic convoy operations, and the Norwegian campaign. He had been mentioned in dispatches in March 1941 for his actions. Later, he became Director General of Naval Aircraft Production, a crucial role that involved coordinating the design and manufacture of aircraft for the Royal Navy. He understood better than most the challenges and opportunities presented by jet technology. In August 1944, John had been given command of HMS Pretoria Castle, a merchant aircraft carrier used for trials and training. Then, in June 1945, he took command of HMS Ocean, a brand-new light fleet carrier that had been commissioned on August 8th. Ocean was one of the Colossus-class carriers, a class designed for rapid construction using simplified mercantile hull standards. She was 695 feet long overall, with a flight deck of similar length. She displaced 13,190 tons standard, 18,000 tons fully loaded. Her 4 Parsons geared steam turbines could drive her at 25 knots, fast enough for flight operations, but nothing like the blistering speeds of the larger fleet carriers. John knew that the Admiralty was intensely interested in jet carrier operations. The question wasn't whether jets would eventually operate from carriers. The question was when and how. The Americans were working on the same problem. In fact, just a month earlier, on November 6, 1945, Ensign Jake West had landed a Ryan FR-1 Fireball on USS Wake Island. The Fireball was a mixed-power aircraft with both a piston engine and a jet engine. West's landing had been made under jet power because his piston engine had failed on approach. It was an impressive piece of flying, but it wasn't quite the same as a purpose-designed jet landing on a carrier by choice. De Havilland had modified the third prototype Vampire LZ-551G, specifically for carrier trials. The modifications were extensive. The flaps were increased in area by 40%, providing more lift at low speeds and allowing a slower approach speed. The air brakes were enlarged, giving the pilot more control over descent rate. Long-travel oleo struts were fitted to the landing gear, allowing the aircraft to absorb the tremendous vertical impact of a carrier landing without collapsing. And an arrestor hook was fitted to the tail, designed to catch one of the wires stretched across the carrier deck. The G suffix after the aircraft's serial number indicated that guards should be posted at all times to maintain secrecy. This wasn't just another test program. This was potentially the future of naval aviation, and the Royal Navy wanted to keep their progress under wraps until they knew whether it would work. Eric Brown was the natural choice to pilot LZ-511G for the carrier trials. By December 1945, he had accumulated extraordinary experience. He had over 2,000 carrier landings under his belt. He had flown dozens of different aircraft types, from lumbering bombers to nimble fighters. He understood the unique demands of carrier operations better than perhaps anyone alive. And he had one other crucial advantage. He was already an experienced jet pilot. Brown had begun flying jets in 1944, evaluating captured German aircraft and British developments. He had an instinctive feel for the unique characteristics of jet propulsion, the way thrust changed with altitude and airspeed, the need to think ahead of the aircraft because of the slow throttle response. In February 1945, he had taught himself to fly the Sikorsky R-4 helicopter using only a manual, flying the rotary wing aircraft from Liverpool to Farnborough. Brown's ability to quickly master new types of aircraft, to understand their quirks and limitations, was legendary within the test pilot community. But even Brown had concerns about the carrier jet trials. The Vampire, while a fine aircraft, was not ideal for carrier work. The centrifugal flow Goblin engine had that slow throttle response, which meant that once you were committed to the landing, you were committed. The aircraft's stall characteristics were different from piston fighters, and the high approach speed meant less margin for error. Brown spent weeks preparing for the trials. He flew LZ-51G from shore bases, practicing the approach profiles and landing techniques he would need on the carrier. He calculated and recalculated the critical speeds, the angles of attack, the power settings. He consulted with Captain John, discussing the ship's position, the weather patterns, the contingency plans if something went wrong. And then there was the matter of the ruse. The Admiralty wanted this to be a planned, deliberate test, but they also wanted the appearance that Brown had been forced to land aboard due to an emergency. This would allow them to downplay the risks if the attempt failed, while still claiming credit for innovation if it succeeded. So a plan was hatched. Brown would fly past the carrier, declare an emergency, and then make his landing approach. Captain John was in on the plan, ready to give permission for the landing. December 3, 1945, dawned cold and gray, a typical English Channel winter day, with a stiff wind out of the west and low clouds scudding across the sky. HMS Ocean took up position off the Isle of Wight, steaming into the wind to provide maximum airflow over the deck. The ship's crew had been briefed on what was about to happen, though many of them privately doubted it would succeed. They had seen carrier operations go wrong too many times. The smallest mistake, the slightest miscalculation, could turn a landing into a disaster. Brown climbed into LZ-51G at the shore base and fired up the Goblin engine. The whine was immediately apparent, so different from the roar of a Merlin or Griffin piston engine. He ran through his checks methodically, leaving nothing to chance. Control surfaces, instruments, radio, everything had to be perfect. This was not a day for taking shortcuts. He advanced the throttle and felt the aircraft begin to roll. The acceleration was smooth, linear, without the surging and bucking of a propeller-driven aircraft. The nose wheel lifted off first, followed moments later by the main gear. Brown was airborne, climbing into the gray December sky. He flew out over the channel, getting a feel for the aircraft. The Vampire handled beautifully, responsive but not twitchy. He practiced his approach speeds, his bank angles, visualizing the carrier deck in his mind. Everything had to be automatic, instinctive. There would be no time for thinking once he started his approach to ocean. After about 20 minutes, Brown turned back toward the carrier. He could see her from several miles away, a dark shape on the gray water, white foam curling from her bow as she steamed into the wind. As he approached, he clicked on his radio. "Ocean, this is Vampire LZ551. I'm declaring an emergency, requesting permission to land aboard." There was a brief pause. On the bridge of HMS Ocean, Captain John exchanged glances with his officers. This was it, the moment they had been planning for weeks. John picked up the radio handset. "Vampire LZ551, this is Ocean. You are cleared to land. Good luck." The deck of HMS Ocean was a hive of controlled activity. The deck crew, in their colored jerseys denoting different specialties, stood ready. The landing signal officer, positioned at the stern of the ship with his colored paddles, prepared to guide Brown in. The arrestor wires were tensioned, ready to catch the Vampire's hook and bring it to a halt. Fire crews stood by with foam cannons ready to respond if disaster struck. Medical personnel waited below decks, hoping they wouldn't be needed. In the ship's operations room, photographers and cameramen focused their equipment on the sky. This landing, whether it succeeded or failed, would be documented for history. Brown brought the Vampire around in a wide arc, positioning himself for his approach. The carrier looked impossibly small from the air, a narrow strip of deck that seemed to pitch and roll with the ocean swells. He had done this thousands of times before with piston-engine aircraft, but this was different. Everything about the jet was different. He extended the flaps fully, feeling the aircraft slow. The increased drag was significant. He adjusted his power setting, keeping the Goblin engine at a constant speed rather than reducing it to idle. This was crucial. If he reduced power too much, the engine would take too long to spool back up if he needed to abort the landing. The Vampire descended through the gray sky. Brown's eyes flicked constantly between the carrier deck and his instruments, building a mental picture of his approach. The altimeter unwound steadily. Airspeed holding at 90 knots, higher than a typical piston fighter approach, but necessary for the jet. Angle of attack, good. Rate of descent, manageable. On the carrier deck, the landing signal officer tracked the Vampire's approach. He could see immediately that Brown's approach was different from what he was used to seeing. The jet's approach was flatter, faster, but somehow more stable. No propeller torque trying to pull the nose around, no engine noise to gauge power settings, just the high-pitched whine of the turbine. The Vampire grew larger in his vision. The LSO's paddles moved, guiding Brown with precision. A slight correction to the right, a touch of power to arrest the descent rate. Everything was happening so fast. Yet to Brown, time seemed to stretch. Every detail was crystal clear, the gray paint on the carrier deck, the faces of the deck crew watching anxiously, the white caps on the ocean waves. Aboard HMS Ocean, every man who could watched the approaching jet. Some prayed silently, others held their breath. Captain John stood on the bridge wing, his hands gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles were white. He had approved this test, had argued for it, but now, watching the reality unfold, he couldn't help but wonder if he had sent Brown to his fate. The carrier's deck rose and fell with the ocean swells. Timing was everything. Land when the deck was at the top of its rise, and you'd slam down with tremendous force. Land when it was falling away, and you might not catch a wire at all, ending up in the barrier or worse, careening over the side into the sea. Brown judged the movement of the deck, his mind processing information faster than conscious thought. He saw the LSO's paddles flash the cut signal, the command to chop the throttle and drop onto the deck. But Brown didn't follow that instruction. He couldn't. Chopping the throttle on a jet meant you had no power available if something went wrong. Instead, he held his power setting and used his high control to fly the aircraft onto the deck. The main wheels of LZ-55WOMDSG touched the carrier deck with a firm but controlled impact. The long travel oleos compressed, absorbing the shock. The nose wheel settled a moment later. And then Brown felt the sharp deceleration as the arrestor hook caught a wire. The wire stretched across the width of the deck, pulling out to form a deep V as it absorbed the Vampire's kinetic energy. Brown was thrown forward against his straps as the aircraft went from 90 knots to 0 in less than 300 feet. The wire screeched under the strain. For a heart-stopping moment, there was concern the wire might part, sending the aircraft careening forward, but the equipment held. The Vampire came to a complete stop, sitting on the deck of HMS Ocean, engines still whining. For a moment, there was absolute silence, except for the sound of the jet engine and the wind. And then the deck erupted in cheers. Men who had been holding their breath released it in shouts of joy and relief. The Vampire hadn't crashed. It hadn't caught fire. It had simply landed as neatly as any aircraft they had ever seen. Brown sat in the cockpit, his hands still on the controls, adrenaline coursing through his body. He had done it. The world's first carrier landing of a pure jet aircraft. The impossible had been achieved. Deck crew swarmed around the Vampire, unhooking the arrestor wire and preparing to move the aircraft. Captain John descended from the bridge, walking across the deck to where Brown was climbing out of the cockpit. The two men shook hands, both grinning broadly. No words were necessary. They both knew what had just been accomplished. But the test wasn't over. A carrier aircraft needed to be able to not just land, but also take off. And jet takeoffs from a carrier presented their own challenges. Would the deck be long enough? Would the aircraft have enough speed by the time it reached the bow? If it didn't, the Vampire would simply drop off the end of the ship and plunge into the channel. The Vampire was brought down to the hangar deck on one of Ocean's elevators. The fuel tanks were topped off. The aircraft was inspected for any damage from the landing. None was found. Everything had worked perfectly. The aircraft was brought back up to the flight deck and positioned for takeoff. Brown climbed back into the cockpit. The takeoff would actually be easier than the landing in some ways. Jets didn't have propeller torque, trying to swing the aircraft to one side. The acceleration was smooth and predictable, and once airborne, jets handled beautifully. HMS Ocean turned back into the wind and worked up to maximum speed. The combination of the ship's speed and the wind speed would give Brown about 40 knots of wind over the deck, crucial for generating lift. He waited for the signal from the flight deck officer. A green flag waved in a circle, indicating takeoff when ready. Brown released the brakes and advanced the throttle to full power. The Goblin engine spooled up, its whine rising to a shriek. The Vampire began to roll down the deck, slowly at first, then faster. The acceleration felt gentle compared to the catapult shots he had experienced on other carriers, but it was steady and reliable. The bow of HMS Ocean grew larger in his windscreen. Brown eased back on the stick. The nose lifted, the main wheels left the deck, and then Brown was airborne again, climbing away from the carrier with ease. The takeoff had been, as he later described it, like a scalded cat. Wine, fast, clean, and effortless. Brown climbed to a safe altitude and then brought the Vampire back around for another landing. The bosses aboard Ocean, having witnessed the first successful landing, wanted more data, and Brown was happy to oblige. He made 3 more landings that day, each one as smooth as the first. On one of them, he caught the 4th wire instead of the first, demonstrating that the system was robust and forgiving. The newspapers of the day trumpeted Brown's achievement. Headlines proclaimed that the jet age had arrived for naval aviation. Photographs of LZ-551G on Ocean's deck appeared in publications worldwide. Eric Brown, the test pilot from Scotland, was suddenly famous, though he characteristically deflected the credit to his team and the aircraft designers. But Brown himself knew the truth, and he shared it candidly in later years. The trials had proven that a jet could land on a carrier, yes, but they had also revealed serious limitations. The Vampire's slow throttle response meant that if a pilot got into trouble on approach, recovery was difficult or impossible. The limited fuel capacity meant loiter time was minimal. And most critically, the skill level required to safely land a centrifugal flow jet on a carrier was extremely high. As Brown put it, very few pilots could land a centrifugal jet on a boat, because there was, for now, no solution to the problem of lift control. If the Royal Navy had tried to put jets into operational service based on these trials, the accident rate would have been catastrophic. Pilots of average skill would have been killed in alarming numbers. The Vampire was a magnificent aircraft for shore-based operations, but for routine carrier work, it simply wasn't ready. What was needed, Brown and others realized, was a new generation of jet engines. Rolls-Royce was developing axial flow engines, which had much better throttle response than the centrifugal flow designs. With an axial flow engine, a pilot could manipulate power settings during the approach much more precisely, giving them better control over their descent rate and speed. These engines would make jet carrier operations not just possible, but practical. It would take several more years before jets became routine aboard carriers. The introduction of the steam catapult, which could accelerate heavy jets to flying speed in a short distance, was crucial. So was the development of the angled deck, which allowed aircraft that missed the arrestor wires to safely take off again without crashing into aircraft parked at the forward end of the deck. Both of these innovations were British developments that were quickly adopted by navies worldwide. But December 3, 1945, remained a pivotal moment. On that cold winter day, Eric Brown and Captain Casper John had proven that jet carrier operations were possible. They had opened a door that could never be closed. The future rushed through that door with a jet engine's scream. Brown's career continued to reach extraordinary heights. In the immediate aftermath of the war, he led Operation Enemy Flight, a mission to capture and evaluate German aviation technology before it fell into Soviet hands or was destroyed. Flying to a Luftwaffe airfield in Denmark, Brown arrived before the Allied ground troops and ended up accepting the surrender of an entire airfield and 2,000 German personnel. He flew dozens of captured German aircraft, including the formidable and deadly Me-163 Comet rocket fighter, one of the most dangerous aircraft ever built. Brown interrogated prominent Germans involved in aviation, including Hermann Göring, Willy Messerschmitt, Ernst Haenkel, and even Wernher von Braun, who would later lead America's space program. His fluent German, learned during a year studying in Germany before the war, made him invaluable for these interrogations. As a test pilot, Brown continued to push boundaries. He flew the de Havilland DH-108, an experimental swept-wing research aircraft that had already taken the life of Jeffrey de Havilland, Jr., and would later claim another test pilot. Brown nearly joined them when control issues during a high-speed dive almost ended fatally. He tested the Saunders Roe SRA-1 jet-powered flying boat and survived a crash in the Solent that left him unconscious in the sinking aircraft until he was pulled from the wreckage. In the 1950s, Brown demonstrated British innovations to the United States Navy, including the steam catapult and angled deck, both of which the Americans adopted enthusiastically. He served in Germany, helping to re-establish German naval aviation as part of NATO. He flew more types of aircraft than any other pilot in history, 487 different types, both fixed-wing and rotary. That record will almost certainly never be broken. Brown made more carrier landings than any other pilot ever. The official count was 2,407 landings and 2,271 takeoffs, though some records vary slightly. These weren't just routine operations. Many were test flights, evaluating new aircraft types, new techniques, new equipment. Each one carried risk. He survived 20 flying accidents during his career, situations that would have ended the lives of less skilled pilots. His diminutive stature, which had earned him the nickname Winkle, may have helped him survive several of these incidents, as he could curl himself into a protective ball within the cockpit. Brown retired from the Royal Navy in 1970 with the rank of captain, having served his country for over 30 years. But he never really left aviation. He wrote extensively about his experiences, producing memoirs that became classics of aviation literature. Wings on My Sleeve, his autobiography, is considered one of the finest books ever written about test flying. He gave lectures and interviews, sharing his knowledge and experiences with new generations of pilots and aviation enthusiasts. He was showered with honors throughout his life and after. He was appointed member of the Order of the British Empire in 1945 for his work landing the Mosquito on carriers. He was promoted to Officer of the Order of the British Empire in 1946 for the Vampire carrier trials and other achievements. In 1970, he was named Commander of the Order of the British Empire. He received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions aboard HMS Audacity. The Air Force Cross recognized his exceptional work as a test pilot. He was made an honorary fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society. In December 2015, at the age of 96, Brown was honored at 10 Downing Street as one of the Great Scots, a celebration of Scottish achievement. The first Sea Lord, Admiral Sir George Zambellis, attended his 97th birthday party at Bucks Club in London in January 2016, along with over 100 other pilots who had come to pay tribute to a legend. Captain Casper John also went on to great things. He became First Sea Lord, the professional head of the Royal Navy, serving from 1960 to 1963. In that role, he championed the development of new aircraft carriers, understanding better than most the importance of naval air power. He was promoted to Admiral of the Fleet, the highest rank in the Royal Navy. He was appointed Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath. The de Havilland Vampire LZ-551-G, the aircraft that made history on December 3, 1945, survived the war and the test programs that followed. After the carrier trials, it was used for experimental work on the flexible deck concept, an idea for allowing aircraft to land without undercarriages, essentially belly landing on a rubber mat. Though the concept proved impractical, the tests provided valuable data. LZ-516G was eventually retired and offered to the Mosquito Aircraft Museum, but space constraints meant the offer was declined. The aircraft was then donated to the Science Museum in London, where it remains to this day, a tangible link to that momentous December day in 1945. HMS Ocean served with distinction in the Korean War and the Suez Crisis before being scrapped in 1962. Other ships have since carried the name Ocean, continuing a proud tradition in the Royal Navy. Looking back from our modern perspective, with nuclear-powered supercarriers launching stealth fighters and drones, it's easy to forget how revolutionary that first jet landing was. The aircraft look primitive now, small and simple compared to modern jets. But at the time, they represented the absolute cutting edge of technology. And the men who flew them were pioneers, exploring a new frontier with courage and skill. The story of Eric Brown's first jet carrier landing encapsulates so much about the nature of human achievement. It required vision, seeing possibilities that others dismissed as impossible. It demanded technical innovation, solving problems that had never been encountered before. It necessitated courage, the willingness to put life on the line for progress. And it called for exceptional skill, the kind that comes from years of dedicated practice and natural talent working in harmony. But perhaps most importantly, It required trust. Captain John had to trust Brown's assessment of the risks and his ability to manage them. Brown had to trust the engineers who designed the Vampire and modified it for carrier operations. The deck crew had to trust both men to execute the plan without endangering them. And the Admiralty had to trust that the potential benefits justified the risks. That web of trust, built on competence and proven through shared challenges, made the impossible possible. It allowed a small aircraft with a screaming jet engine to land on a pitching deck in the middle of the English Channel, changing naval warfare forever. December 3rd, 1945. A cold, gray day that began with doubt and ended with triumph. A day when one pilot, one aircraft, and one carrier proved that the future had arrived. The jet age was here, and nothing would ever be the same. As the Vampire's engine wound down on HMS Ocean's deck that historic afternoon, as Eric Brown climbed from the cockpit with a broad smile on his face, as Captain John crossed the deck to shake his hand, they all knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. They had seen the moment when naval aviation pivoted from its past to its future. In the years that followed, jets would become the dominant force in naval air power. American carriers would launch F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam, proving the devastating effectiveness of jet-powered carrier aviation in combat. British carriers would deploy Sea Harriers in the Falklands War, demonstrating that even small carriers could punch above their weight with vertical takeoff jets. Modern supercarriers would become floating cities, capable of launching round-the-clock air operations that could influence events hundreds of miles inland. All of it traced back, in some way, to that December day in 1945. To a Scottish test pilot with exceptional skills and iron nerves, to a Royal Navy captain willing to support a risky test, to a modified de Havilland Vampire that represented the best of British aviation engineering, and to a crew aboard HMS Ocean who watched history being made. Eric Brown passed away on February 21, 2016, at the age of 97. His death was mourned throughout the aviation community and beyond. The tributes poured in from around the world, from pilots, engineers, historians, and aviation enthusiasts. They spoke of his unmatched achievements, his humble demeanor, his willingness to share his knowledge, and his lifelong dedication to advancing aviation. A memorial service was held at the Fleet Air Arm Museum at RNAS Yeovilton, where the Vampire he flew sits on display. A fly past honored his memory, jets screaming overhead in the Missing Man formation, a traditional military aviation tribute to fallen pilots. But perhaps the greatest tribute is the simple fact that every time a jet fighter launches from a carrier deck anywhere in the world, every time a pilot traps aboard a ship at sea, they are following in Eric Brown's footsteps. They are benefiting from the courage and skill he demonstrated on that cold December day. They are part of a legacy that began when one man proved that jets belonged on carriers. The story of the first jet carrier landing reminds us that progress often comes from individuals willing to take calculated risks, to push beyond established boundaries, to believe that the impossible might just be possible after all. It shows us that innovation requires not just brilliant ideas, but also the courage to test those ideas in the real world, where failure can mean the difference between life and passing. Captain Eric Winkle Brown stood just 5 feet 7 inches tall, but on December 3, 1945, he was a giant. He flew into history on the wings of a jet aircraft, proving that the future of naval aviation had arrived. His legacy lives on every time a pilot touches down on a carrier deck, every time a jet launches into the sky from a ship at sea. And that legacy began with what many considered a crazy order, the order to land a jet on an aircraft carrier when everyone knew it couldn't be done. The order that changed everything. The order that opened the jet age for naval aviation. As the sun set over the English Channel that December evening, As HMS Ocean turned for home, with her precious cargo safely aboard, the men on that ship knew they had been part of something special. They had witnessed the future. They had seen the impossible become reality. They had been there when everything changed. The jet age had arrived at sea, and it all began with one landing, one pilot, one aircraft, and one order that seemed crazy until it succeeded. Then it wasn't crazy at all. It was visionary. It was revolutionary. It was the day that changed naval warfare forever.